Hi everybody, how are y'all doing today? We're going to pick up reading in the Ponder Heart again, and this will be our third reading. Remember the last time Uncle Daniel had went and got married without anyone knowing it, and he was of course, in Grandpa's car because he had sneaked off with Grandpa's car, and here he has shown up. He had Narcissus, the cook, drive for him. And so we are going to see what happens next. Are you ready? Before I can turn around, Judge Tip Clanahan balls down out of the window. Edna Earl? His office has been the same place forever, next door up over the movie. But that never keeps me from jumping. Now what? What am I going to do with Daniel? Skin him? Or are you all going to kill him first? I tell you right here and now, I'm going to turn him over to DeYancey. If you don't mind out for him better than that. Judge Tip gets us out of fixes. And hurt Uncle Daniel's feelings? I call up. DeYancey is just his grandson, young and goes off on tangents. Come one thing more, I'll turn him over. Judge Tip balls down to the street. Where are we going to call the halt? Look where I'm having to send after Sam. Okay, Sam is Grandpa. None too sure to get him. I can't make a habit out of that. And if you remember, Grandpa got kept at the asylum instead of Uncle Daniel. I left the whole array down there and climbed straight up those hot stairs and said to his face, You ought to be ashamed, Judge Clanahan. I do mind out. Everybody living minds out for Uncle Daniel, the best they can. It's you and Grandpa go too far with discipline. Just try to remember, Uncle Daniel's blessed with a fond and loving heart, and two old cronies like you and Grandpa can't get around that by marrying him off too. I made him a face like a cis-drunk. And then unmarrying him, leaving him free for the next one or running off with him to another place. That's child foolishness, and I don't like to be fussed at in public at this time of the afternoon. Go home, girl, says Judge Tip, and get ready for your grandfather. He's loose and on his way. Already talked to DeYancey on the long distance. Don't know why he wouldn't wait. I got no intention of washing my hands of Daniel or any other Ponder, and I'm not surprised for a minute at anything that transpires, only I'm a quite studious man and don't take to all this commotion under my window. It woke him up, that's what. I don't see why there has to be any commotion anywhere, I says, and down on the street I made up my mind I'd say that to everybody. People get married beneath them every day, and I don't see any sign of the world coming to an end. Don't be so small town. That held them till Grandpa got back. He got back sooner than I dreamed. I shook my big purse at him when the car went by to head him off, but he and DeYancey just hightailed it straight through town and out to the place. Nearly everybody still in the house along the way got out front in time to see them pass. I understand Miss T. Kate McGee even drove by Ponder Hill, pretending she was looking for wild plums. I said, Edna Earl, you'd better get on out of here. All right, I said, but let me get one bath. It generally takes 3 running this hotel on a summer day. I said shoo to the rummage sale and let them go on to the store. While I was in the tub, ring went the telephone. Mr. Springer got to town just in time to answer it. I had to come down in front of him in my kimono, and there was DeYancey calling from the Crossroads store. I could hear their 2 good-for-nothing canaries. I fussed at him for not stopping here with Grandpa, because he might know I'd have something to tell him. DeYancey said he had a surprise for me that he'd better not tell me in front of a lot of people. I could have sworn I heard Eva's cis-trunk swallow. Tell me quick, Yancey Clanahan, I says. I've all got my hat on now. I've all but got my hat on now. I think I know what it is. The Yancey only starts at the beginning. He said he and Grandpa pulled up yonder under the tree at the Ponder place and went marching in by the front door. I told him they hadn't been beat home by much. Mr. Springer called from his room that to Silver City and back and to the asylum and back is just about equal distance. The Yancey said they heard running feet over their heads and running feet on the stairs, and whisked through the old bead curtains of the parlor came somebody that poor Grandpa had never laid eyes on in his life, and our dream existed. She's been upstairs, downstairs, and in my lady's chamber, says the Yancey. She was very much at home. No surprise so far, I says. Bonnie D. Peacock. All in pink, he said, like I wasn't telling him a bit. And she'd pick one of Narcissus nasturtiums and had it in her mouth like a pipe, sucking the stem. She ran to the parlor windows and took a good look out of each one. He said Uncle Daniel came in behind her, and after he kissed Grandpa, stepped to the mantel and rested his elbow on it in a kind of grand way. They smelled awful smoke. He had one of Grandpa's cigars lighted. Narcissus was singing Hallelujah somewhere off. I said, but Yancey, you're leaving out what I want to hear. The words. What did Grandpa say? Yancey said, Grandpa whispered. I don't believe you. Yancey said, it's all true. He whispered and said, they're right. Who? I said. Well, the Clanahans. Well, the Clanahans, said Yancey. He whispered, and Yancey whispered, all hollow and full of birds singing over the wires with Lord knows who not with us. When the brains were being handed around, my son Daniel was standing behind the door. Help, I said, and did Uncle Daniel hear it? Let me go, Yancey. I haven't got time for conversation. I've got to get out there and stand up for both of them. Don't you want to hear the surprise? He says. Well, he did have a surprise. He just had to get to it. Do you know it turned out that she had just married Uncle Daniel on trial? Miss Bonnie D. Peacock of Polk took a red nasturtium out of her mouth to say that was the best she could do. After that, Grandpa just pounded with his stick and sent Yancey out of his sight with a message he would speak to them in the morning. And when he was getting his car out of the yard, Yancey said Narcissus had the fattest chicken of all down on the block and hollered at him, we's going to keep her, and brought her axe down whack. Just hang up and go home and take a bath, Yancey, I says. I've heard all I'm going to. I'm going to put on my hat. Well, it's our hearts. We run to sudden ends, all we ponders. I say it's our hearts, though Dr. Eubanks declares Grandpa just popped a blood vessel. Grandpa, Uncle Daniel, and Bonnie D. still in pink were all about to sit down. I was just walking in the door, smelled chicken. Uncle Daniel says to me, just in time, Edna Earl. Poor Papa. You know, Edna Earl, he's hard to please. And lo and behold. Okay, just a moment. Let me get a drink of water. We had the funeral in the Presbyterian Church, of course, and it was packed. I haven't been able to think of anybody that didn't come. It had mortified the Sistrunks that falling behind one of them so close would come a peacock. But with Grandpa going the sudden way he did, they rallied and turned up in their best, and Miss Teacake asked to be allowed to sing Beautiful Isle of Somewhere was her choice. Uncle Daniel held every eye at the services. That was the best thing in the world for Uncle Daniel because it distracted him from what was going on. Oh, he hates sickness and death, will hardly come in the room with it. He can't abide funerals. The reason every eye was on him was not just because he was rich as Croesus now, but he looked different. Bonnie D had started in on him and cut his hair. Now I'll tell you about Bonnie D. Bonnie D could make change, and Bonnie D could cut hair. If you ask me, can I do either? The answer is no. Bonnie D may have been tongue-tied in public and hardly able to stand in high heels till she learned how, but she could cut your hair to a fare ye well, to within a good inch of your life if you put a pair of scissors in her hand. Uncle Daniel used to look like a senator, but that day his hair wasn't much longer than the fuzz of a peach. Uncle Daniel still keeps it like that. He loves himself that way. Oh, but he was proud of her. She's a natural-born barber, he said, and pretty as a doll. What would I do without her? He had the hardware salesman bring her a whole line of scissors and sharp blades. I was afraid she'd fringe everything in the house. Well, ignorance is bliss. Except Bonnie D, poor little old thing, didn't know how to smile. Yawned all the time, like cats do. So delicate and dainty she didn't even have any heels to speak of. She didn't stick out anywhere, and I don't know why you couldn't see through her. 17 years old and seemed like she just stayed 17. They had that grand Narcissus, had her and never appreciated her. It didn't seem to me they ate out there near enough to keep her happy. Excuse me a moment. It had turned out Narcissus could sit at a wheel and drive. Of course, her and Grandpa Studebaker both getting older by the minute. But she could still reach the pedals, and they'd still catch a little. Where they headed for, of course, was right here, a good, safe place to end up, with the hitching post there to catch them at the foot of the walk. They sashayed in at the front, Narcissus sashayed in at the back, and all ate with me. That's how everybody, me, and whoever was in here at this time, drummers, boarders, lawyers, and strangers, had to listen to Uncle Daniel myrate and gyrate over Bonnie D. With her right there at the table, we had to take on over her too, every last one of us, and tell him how pretty and smart we thought she was. It didn't bother her one whit. I don't think she was listening to amount to a row of pins. You couldn't tell. She just sat and picked at the Beulah food like a canary bird, and by the time Uncle Daniel was through eating and talking and pulled her up, it would be too late for the show for everybody. So he'd holler, "Narcissus," out of the back, and they'd all three hop back in the car and go chugging home. Now, the only bad thing about the Ponder place is where it is. Poor Grandpa had picked him a good high spot to build the house on, but where he could see all around him and if anybody was coming. And that turned out to be miles from nowhere. We filled up the house with rooms, and the rooms with furniture, all before he let Grandma in it. And then, of course, she brought her own perfectly good rosewood in right on top of it. And he had trimmed the house inside and outside, top, side, and bottom, with every trimming he could get his hands on or money could buy, and painted the whole thing bright as a railroad station. Anything to outdo the Beulah Hotel. And I think maybe he did outdo it. For one thing, he sprinkled that Ruth with lightning rods the way Grandma would sprinkle coconut on a cake, and was just as pleased with himself as she was with herself. Remarkable. I don't think it ever occurred to either one of them that they lived far out. They were so evenly matched. It took Grandpa years to catch on it was lonesome. They considered town was far. I've sometimes thought of turning that place into something, if and when it ever comes down to me and I can get the grass out of it. Nobody lives in the house now. The Pepper family we've got on the place don't do a thing but run it. A chinchilla farm may be the answer. But that's the future. Don't think about it, Edna Earl, I say. So I just cut out a little ad about a booklet that you can send off for and put it away in a drawer. I forget where. So the marriage trial, only it had completely left our minds. It was one. Went on for 5 years and 6 months. And Bonnie D, if you please, decided no. Not that she said as much to his soul. She was tongue-tied when it came to words. She left a note written in a pencil tablet on the kitchen table, and when Narcissus went out to cut up the chicken, she found it. She carried it to Uncle Daniel in the barn, and Uncle Daniel read it to her out loud. Then they both sat down on the floor and cried. It said, "Have left out goodbye and good luck. Your friend, Miss Bonnie D. Peacock Ponder." We don't even know which one of them it was to. Then she just traipsed out to the crossroads and flagged down the northbound bus with her little handkerchief. Oh, she was seen. A dozen people must have been in the bushes and seen her, or known somebody that did, and they all came and told me about it, though nobody at all appeared to tell me where she got off. It's not beyond me. You see, poor, trusting Uncle Daniel carried the child out there and set her down in a big house with a lot of rooms and corners, with Negroes to wait on her, and she wasn't used to a bit of it. She wasn't used to keeping house at all, except by fit and starts, much less telling Negroes what to do, and she didn't know what to do with herself all day. But how would she tell him a thing like that? He was older than she was, and he was good as gold, and he was prominent, and he wasn't even there all the time. Uncle Daniel couldn't stay home. He wanted her there all right, waiting when he got back, but he made Narcissus bring him in town first, every night, so he could have a little better audience. He wanted to tell about how happy he was. The way I look back at Bonnie D, her story was this. She'd come up from the country, and before she knew it, she was right back in the country, married or no. She was away out yonder on Ponder Hill and nothing to do and nothing to play with in sight but the dogs and the cats and one little frizzly hen. From the kind of long pink fingernails she kept in the 10-cent store, that hadn't been her idea at all, not her dream. I think they behaved. I don't think they fought all over the place like the Clanahan girls and the Sistrunk boys when they married. They wouldn't know how. Uncle Daniel never heard a cross word in his life. Even if Bonnie D, with her origins, could turn and spit like a cat, I hardly think she would around Uncle Daniel. That wouldn't be called for. I don't blame Bonnie D. Don't blame her for a minute. I could just beat her on the head, that's all. And I did think one thing was the funniest joke on her in the world. Uncle Daniel didn't give her any money, not a cent. I discovered that one day. I don't think it ever occurred to him to give anything to Bonnie D, because he had her. When she said trial, that didn't mean anything to Uncle Daniel. That would alarm him. The only kind of trials he knew about were the ones across the street from the Beulah in the courthouse. He was fond of those. I passed her some money myself now and then, or I bought her something ladylike to put on her back. I couldn't just leave her the way she was. She never said more than thank you. Of course, Uncle Daniel wasn't used to money himself. With Grandpa in his grave, it was Miss Sistrunk at the bank that gave him his allowance, $3 a month. and he spent that mostly the first day on children. They were the ones came out and asked him for things. Uncle Daniel was used to purely being rich, not having money. The riches were all off in the clouds somewhere, like true love is, I guess, like a castle in the sky where he could just sit and dream about it being up there for him. But money wouldn't be safe with him a minute. It would be like giving matches to a child. Well, how the whole town did feel it when Bonnie D lit out. When we sat in here night after night and saw that pearly gray Stetson coming in view and moving up the walk, all we could do was hope and pray Uncle Daniel was here to tell us she was back. But she wasn't. He'd peep in both windows from the porch, then go around by the back and come in through the kitchen so we could speak to Ada. He'd point out what she'd have on his plate, usually ham and steak and chicken and cornbread and sweet potatoes and fried okra and tomatoes and onion and egg plus banana pie. I think that all sounds good to me. I think I'd like something to eat, honestly. And take his seat in the dining room, and when it came up, go, one big groan. And I'd call everybody to supper. Just a moment. Uncle Daniel would greet us at the table. Have you seen her, son? Has a soul here seen my wife? Man alive, my wife's done left me out there by myself in the empty house. Oh, you know her if you came across her. She's tiny as a fairy and pretty as a doll and smart beyond compare, boys. That's what she told him. And now she's gone, clean as a whistle. There'd be a little crowd sitting close on both sides before he knew it, and he'd go into his tale. It would be like drawing his eye teeth not to let him go on and tell it, though it was steadily breaking his heart. Like he used to be bound and determined to give you a present. But that was a habit he had outgrown and forgotten now. It was safer for his welfare to let him talk than to let him give away, but harder on his constitution, on everybody's. But I don't think he could bring himself to believe the story till he'd heard himself tell it again. And every night when she'd come to the end, he'd screw his eyes up tight with fresh tears and stand up and kiss me good night and pull his hat down off the rack. So I'd holler Narcissus out of the kitchen for him. She came out looking sadder and sadder every time, too. And she'd carry him on home. I knew he'd be back the next night. Eva's sister said she couldn't make her mind whether it was good or bad for this hotel, though I don't believe she was asked. Things would look like a birthday party inside. Such a fine crowd. Some out-of-town people hanging on to the story and commiserating with Uncle Daniel, and the Clay people cheering him on, clapping him on the shoulder. Everybody here, young or old, knew what to say, as well as he did. When he sat there at the big middle table he always headed for, all dressed up in sparkling white and his red tie shining, with his plate heat up to overflowing and his knife and fork in hand, ready and waiting to begin his tale of woe, he'd be in good view from the highway both north and south, and it was real prosperous looking in here, till he came to the part about the note, of course, and how Narcissus light-footed it out to the barn and handed it to him so pleased, for he was feeding his calf, and he broke down at the table and ruined it all. But that's what he came in here for, cry, and to eat in company. He ate me out of house and home, not so much to be eating as to be consoling himself, and us. We begged him to eat, not to cry. But some nights when he had a full house, I'd have to flit along back by the back of his chair and say under my breath, Uncle Daniel, FHB. He'd just catch me and say, Edna Earl, where do you suppose she could have gotten to by this time? Memphis, maybe? Memphis was about the limit Uncle Daniel could stand to think of. That's where everybody else had it in mind she went to. That's where she'd go. That's where they'd go. Somebody'd always be fool enough to ask Uncle Daniel how come he didn't hop in his car and drive on up to Memphis and look for Bonnie D. if he wanted her back that bad. Some brand new salesman would have to say, "It can be driven in 3 hours and 45 minutes. "Believe that's just what I'll do, sir," Uncle Daniel would say, to be nice. "Yes, sir. I'll go up there in the cool of the morning and let you know what I find, too. Miss Elsie Fleming, I wonder where she is," he said now and then, too. Well, he just never can forget anybody. But you wouldn't dream of going to Memphis to find Bonnie D. or intrepid Elsie Fleming or you or anybody else. But Uncle Daniel belongs in Clay, and by now he's smart enough to know it, and if he wasn't, I'd tell him. "Never mind, Uncle Daniel," I come up again to say when the tears fill. "How of Fatima? He adores to smoke those. I'll order off after them for him and always keep an extra supply on hand, and I'd like him one." I don't really think Uncle Daniel missed Bonnie D. as much as he thought he did. He had me. He appeared at the Beulah every night of the world, sure as shooting, and every morning to boot. And of course, when he'd come down sick out there, he'd holler for Edna Earl. I looked up the Beulah. I locked up the Beulah. Well, it wouldn't lock, but I spoke to it and said, "Burglars, stay away." You think that would do any good? And went out to Ponder Hill in my trusty Ford to take care of him. When I got there, I missed Grandpa meeting me in the hall and telling me this had put him in a quandary. The house is almost exactly the same as the hotel, but it's a mile easier to run. If you know what you want done, you can just ask in the morning for someone to help you, and Uncle Daniel hollers in the fields, and they come just like for Grandpa. They don't know anything, but you can't try telling them and see what happens. And there's always Narcissus. By now she had a black smear across her aprons that the steering wheel made on her stomach. She sat up so close to the windshield to see how to drive. I made her get back to the stove. I missed my city lights. I guess electricity was about the bane of Grandpa's life, next to weakness of character. Some power fellow was eternally coming out there and wanting to string it up to the house, and Grandpa'd say, "Young man, do you want to draw the lightning out here to me when I've done everything I know how to prevent it?" and throw him out. We all grew up learning to fend for ourselves. Though you may not be able to read in the dark, I can. But all the other children and grandchildren went away to the ends of the earth or died and left only me and Uncle Daniel, the two favorites. So we couldn't leave each other. As a matter of fact, when I went back in that house to look after Uncle Daniel when he was sick, I'd have been lonesome myself if I hadn't liked to read and had good eyes. I'm a great reader that never has time to read. Little old Bonnie D. had 6 years of true love story and 6 years of movie mirror stacked up on the sewing machine in my room. She never hesitated to shift the furniture and the hat rack in the hall and down behind the pillows on the sofa. She must have read her heart out, or at least she'd cut all the coupons out with her scissors. I saw by the holes she'd left where she'd sent off for all kinds of things. You know, wherever they showed the postman smiling in the ad. I figured she must have got back some time or other 24 samples of world-famous perfumes and a free booklet on how to speak and write masterly English from a Mr. Cody who looks a great deal like Professor McKee from Clay, who's been dead for years, and a free piano lesson to prove you can amaze your friends. and a set of Balsic to examine 10 days free of charge, but she must have decided against it. I looked everywhere. So there were holes in the stories all the way through, but they wouldn't have lasted me long anyway. I read The House of 1,000 Candles for the 1,000th time, and the rest of the time I cleaned house. The hotter it is, the faster I go. Okay, we're going to stop right there. All right. Okay, so I hope you're enjoying this. We have more to look forward to. We need to figure out where Bonnie D did go to. Do you think she went to Memphis, or do you think she went back home? Give me your answer, what you think. All right. Y'all have a good evening. Bye-bye.